Grant Pritchard lifted his glass like the room belonged to him, smiling across the candlelit table while every polished face waited for permission to laugh. 34 and still alone. Brenna, he drawled. Sweet enough for strangers and sharp enough for me. I guess even patience has a deadline. A few guests chuckled because Grant had trained people to laugh before deciding whether he... I set my glass down slowly, and the crystal touched the white linen with one clean sound that made Celeste Arden stop smiling. The anniversary dinner had been arranged inside a private arts foundation dining room in Providence. Antique mirrors, winter roses, and money pretending not to speak. Grant sat near the head, exactly where he had always believed he belonged, with Celeste beside him in champagne silk and borrowed confidence. Miles Keaton lowered his eyes toward the menu, pretending the insult had landed somewhere harmless, but his knife stopped moving beside his plate. That small pause told me the truth more clearly than anyone's sympathy could have. They had heard him. They had understood him. And they were still deciding whether my humiliation was worth interrupting dessert. I looked at Grant, really looked at him, and found nothing new except how little power his old rhythm had left over me. Once, that smile could make me soften my voice, smooth the table, rescue the evening, and disappear inside the role he preferred. Tonight, I felt no heat in my face, no panic beneath my ribs, no need to prove I had survived him properly. Celeste tilted her head, waiting for me to shrink in the expensive silence she had helped arrange. I let that silence stretch until it stopped belonging to them, then answered, "Don't worry about who wants me. Grant, you were never good at knowing what stayed valuable." His smile held, but the room did not move with it, and that was the first fracture in the little performance he had planned. Celeste blinked once, too quickly, while Grant gave a short laugh meant to pull the table back into obedience. "That sounds rehearsed," he murmured, still pretending this was harmless. I folded my napkin beside my plate, keeping my hands calm because calm had always frightened him more than anger. "No," I said, meeting his eyes without borrowing anyone's permission. "I just haven't been alone in 8 years." For a moment, the sentence seemed too simple for the room to accept, as if truth needed decoration before wealthy people recognized it. Miles looked up then, not politely, but sharply, and one guest stopped with her wineglass halfway to her mouth. Celeste's mouth parted before she remembered to close it, and Grant laughed again, only this time the sound arrived a second too early. That was how I knew he had not expected me to bring anything real into the trap he built. I leaned back slightly, not triumphant, not nervous, just finished being the woman he invited there to pity. 2 weeks before that dinner, the invitation arrived on ivory paper thick enough to feel like an apology nobody intended to make. It was addressed to Brenna Ward. No +1. No handwritten line. No hint that Celeste Arden understood basic courtesy. I almost dropped it into the recycling. But my mother, Lydia Ward, saw it on my kitchen counter before I could. She touched the corner of the envelope, read the silence built into it, and murmured, "Go if you want closure. Not permission." That should have been the end of it. Except Celeste had always confused polish with intelligence, and careless people leave paper trails. 3 days later, a vendor coordinator forwarded me the seating packet by mistake. Using an old email Grant never bothered removing from his archive. I opened it expecting menu revisions or parking details, then saw my name placed near Miles Keaton's sponsor table with a note beside it. "Seat Brenna near sponsor table. Capture contrast with Grant and Celeste if natural." I sat in my quiet Providence kitchen with that sentence glowing on my laptop, and the whole invitation finally stopped pretending. The party was not the trap, because the party was only the stage Celeste wanted dressed in flowers, glassware, and plausible deniability. The trap was the seating chart, the photographer note, the missing +1, and the assumption that I would arrive alone enough to be useful. I did not feel shocked, I felt the strange calm that comes when insult becomes evidence. I saved the email, downloaded the attachment, and sent both to the attorney who had handled the last administrative pieces of my divorce. She did not dramatize it, which was why I trusted her, and her answer came back clean enough to settle my nerves. Public rudeness was not a lawsuit, but using my name, image, and assumed marital status in promotional material created real professional risk. She advised a narrow notice if necessary. Not a performance. Just protection against false light, unauthorized use, and donor-facing distortion. That mattered because my life had become quieter, not smaller, after Grant, and I had protected that quiet with both hands. I worked with private textile collections, museum families, and old foundations that cared more about preservation than applause. Owen Bellamy and I had been married 8 years by then. Not hidden, not ashamed, simply private, in a way loud people resent. So I accepted the invitation, not because I wanted a scene, but because Grant and Celeste had written one without knowing I could read. I arrived in a navy dress that did not ask for attention, but did not apologize for entering the room either. Inside, the foundation dining room glowed with candles, winter roses, and careful money. While Providence stayed cold beyond the windows, Grant Pritchard saw me first, smiling like a man, greeting evidence he expected to manage. Celeste Arden crossed to me in champagne silk, brushed air near my cheek, and made even welcome feel rehearsed. Dinner began with polished ease, the kind people use when they agree not to notice discomfort too early. Celeste waited until Miles Keaton turned toward our side of the table before glancing at my empty second-place setting. "Did you come straight from work, Brenna? Or is it just you tonight?" she wondered. And I answered, "Just me tonight was the invitation you sent." Her smile stayed on, but Miles lowered his menu. And that tiny movement told me the question had landed. After the first course, Grant stood with one hand on his chair, accepting silence before he had earned it. He spoke about legacy, loyalty, and people who stood beside a vision before the world understood it. He never mentioned the years I had made introductions, softened rooms, remembered names, and protected his confidence from carelessness. Celeste watched him like a woman guarding a prize she still needed the room to admire. Then Grant turned toward me with that familiar half-smile, and the room adjusted before he even spoke. "Some chapters close for a reason," he offered, light enough for strangers, sharp enough for anyone who remembered the divorce. Celeste laughed first, too quickly, and scattered amusement followed her lead, like cutlery sliding across porcelain. Miles set his knife down while the photographer near the doorway shifted closer. That was when I knew the vendor note had not exaggerated the plan. It had only failed to capture how practiced they looked performing it. Grant leaned back, enjoying the silence he thought charm had purchased, and let his gaze settle on my bare left hand. 34 and still alone. He continued. "Sweet, with public cruelty. I guess even patience has a deadline." I placed my glass down slowly, letting Crystal cut through the laughter before I looked from Celeste to the photographer. "You planned this better than your anniversary speech," I said, and Celeste's fingers tightened around her glass. Grant's smile thinned as he pressed. "What is that supposed to mean?" I kept my voice calm, because calm was the one language he never learned to manage. "Some people hear silence and mistake it for an empty room," I answered, and his next question walked him straight into the truth he had invited me to hide. "So say it, Brenna," he challenged. "Who exactly is standing beside you now?" "My husband," I answered, and the words landed so cleanly that no one seemed ready to touch them at first. Celeste turned her face toward me, her smile losing shape before she could rebuild it. "Your husband?" she managed, soft enough to pretend she was only confused. Grant laughed once, but the sound came too quickly, and nobody at the table followed him. "Since when?" he pressed. still holding his glass like control could be kept by posture. I looked at the candle flame between us and let him wait for the number. 8 years, I answered, and Miles Keaton looked up as if someone had changed the contract terms aloud. A woman beside him froze with her wine glass halfway lifted, while Celeste forgot to blink. Grant stared at me, and for the first time that night, his expression had to work harder than his mouth. "That is not possible," he murmured, but the certainty in his voice arrived thinner than his accusation. I reached into my clutch, unlocked my phone, and opened a folder without naming it anything sentimental. When I turned the screen toward him, the first photograph was not dramatic enough to dismiss. Owen Bellamy and I stood outside a Boston museum opening, his hand resting at my back while I laughed at something outside the frame. The next image showed a printed invitation addressed to Brenna Ward Bellamy and Owen Bellamy, with the date clear beneath the foundation seal. Another was our kitchen table one Sunday morning. 2 coffee cups, his reading glasses, my work gloves. Ordinary proof Noah Powered would think to stage. Grant took the phone because refusing to look would have given the room too much information. He swiped once, then again, and each small movement made his silence harder to explain. Celeste leaned closer, no longer performing disinterest, while Miles watched Grant instead of the screen. Photos prove people stood near each other, Grant managed, placing the phone down with more care than pride wanted. I slid it back toward myself and answered, "No, Grant. Your problem is they prove enough." Celeste's voice came thinner now, stripped of champagne warmth. "Why would you hide something like that?" I looked at her because the answer belonged partly to the woman who had tried to turn my empty chair into entertainment. Because every time I shared something valuable around people like this, someone tried to price it, rank it, or use it. I told her. Her eyes dropped to the table, and that tiny retreat said more than denial could have. Grant recovered enough to aim for ownership again, because that was the only direction he trusted. "Who is he?" he demanded, and I heard the old habit in the question. "Not concern. Only inventory." "Owen Bellamy," I answered, calm enough to make the name feel settled before they could touch it. He designs architectural lighting for museums, theaters, and restored historic spaces, and he has never needed me to be proof of his importance. That answer changed the room more than any photograph had, because it gave Owen weight without turning him into spectacle. Grant's jaw tightened, Celeste's glass lowered, and Miles glanced once toward the photographer near the doorway. I placed my phone back into my clutch, then took out the folded vendor note I had carried there untouched all evening. "And since everyone is finally interested in what was real," I said, setting it on the linen, "we can talk about what you planned." I did not read the vendor note aloud, because performance was Grant's language, and I had stopped translating myself for his benefit. I slid the folded page toward Miles Keaton, whose foundation name sat at the top of the packet like a signature he had not approved. He opened it carefully, and the room watched the paper instead of me, which told me the power had moved. His eyes stopped on my name, then on the line about seating me near the sponsor table, then lower, where Celeste's approval initials sat beside the photographer instruction. Grant reached for the page, but Miles kept one hand on it, polite enough to avoid spectacle and firm enough to deny access. Celeste's color changed before her posture did, a tiny retreat that made her champagne silk look suddenly too bright. "That is vendor language," Grant insisted, but his voice pressed too hard against the quiet. I looked at Celeste, not Grant, because the note had finally given the right person the right weight. "Your initials are beside the approval line, Celeste," I said, and her silence answered faster than any confession. She tried to recover with a small breath and a smaller smile, but the table had already learned where to look. "An assistant must have misunderstood the tone," she offered, and Miles folded the page once instead of returning it. That crease sounded softer than my glass had, but it did more damage because it came from the sponsor, not the woman they meant to embarrass. One guest set down her napkin, and another looked toward the doorway as if association itself had become inconvenient. I kept my voice low because there was nothing to win by sounding wounded in a room built to measure composure. My attorney would send a narrow notice by morning, preventing the use of my name, image, marital status, or likeness in any recap, donor packet, social post, or promotional material. It was not a threat big enough for Grant to mock, and that made it worse for him. It was procedure, clean and usable, the kind of consequence that slips into inboxes and changes calendars. Miles glanced once at Grant, then at Celeste, and finally at the foundation seal printed across the top of the packet. "We will review the engagement," he said. 5 ordinary words that drained more color from Grant than any insult could have. Grant opened his mouth, then closed it, because consulting men know exactly what review means when spoken by the person paying them. Celeste whispered that this was being blown out of proportion, but even she heard how weak it sounded once the paper existed. "No," I answered, standing without rushing. "This is proportion. You just never expected to be measured by your own paperwork." Grant's face sharpened, wounded pride, searching for anger. But anger needed an audience still willing to follow him. I took my coat from the chair while the photographer lowered his camera, finally understanding that the image worth capturing had become legally useless. Before leaving, I looked at Grant one last time and gave him the only ending that fit the invitation. "You invited the woman you thought I still was," I said, calm enough for everyone to hear. "She couldn't make it." I left the foundation before the room found a safer version of what had happened, and Providence met me with clean winter air. My hands did not shake at the car, which surprised me more than Grant's cruelty ever had. Grant had invited an old version of me. Celeste prepared a place setting for her, and neither noticed she was gone. When I turned onto my street, the windows were lit, and that simple brightness undid what the dinner never could. Owen Bellamy was in the kitchen when I walked in, sleeves rolled back, one glass of water beside the sink. He did not ask whether I had destroyed anyone, because Owen never needed my pain to become entertainment before taking it seriously. He read my face without grabbing for the story and only asked, "Are you okay?" I set my coat over the chair and answered, "Better than okay. Clear." By morning, consequences arrived without shouting. Exactly the way real consequences usually do. Miles Keaton emailed Grant and Celeste that the foundation would pause their engagement, pending review of the vendor packet and approval chain. The photographer confirmed no images of me would be released without written clearance, and my attorney sent the notice before lunch. Guests who had laughed too quickly sent messages saying they had not understood, which meant they understood enough. Grant called after 11, and his name on my screen looked smaller than memory had made it. I answered because fear was no longer making decisions for me, and his voice arrived stripped of polish. "Was it true the whole time?" he asked, and I let the silence hold him before saying, "Yes." When he asked why I had never told him, the answer came without anger. "Because you would have turned my piece into your opinion." Celeste sent one message claiming I had cost her gala, then blamed stress, assistance, and misunderstood tone. I forwarded it because her words tied the damage back to the approval note she thought would stay invisible. Lydia called that evening, and my mother did not celebrate anyone's humiliation. She simply breathed softly and said, "You came home to yourself. That's enough." That Sunday, Owen and I walked near the river while the city moved around us without knowing anything had changed. Grant would chase rooms where approval sounded like applause, and Celeste would learn polish cannot erase paperwork. I had a home, marriage, a name that needed no permission, and a piece no seating chart could shrink. Being misunderstood by the wrong people felt less like loss and more like freedom. Thank you for spending this story with me. If you have ever rebuilt quietly while others misunderstood you, I hope this felt like company. Tell me where you are watching from and what peace looks like to you now. Subscribe for more stories about courage, love, and starting over gently.